take action in one way or another.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about myself. So, for example, we still drive a big gas guzzling Toyota 4Runner. And the reason that we do is because it doesn't make that big a difference for us to switch yet. But that's because I work from home. I barely drive anywhere. I fill up that car a couple of times a year. Only time that we use it is on the weekends, and it has a specific purpose for camping and getting us outside in the wilderness. And so to replace that vehicle, we don't have an option to replace that yet with a vehicle that is electric, for example, that can get to, halfway up a mountain. That's the purpose of that vehicle for us. And so because we don't drive anywhere, there's no value in us spending our money yet on replacing that for an electric vehicle. So what my partner and I have done, however, is we recently replaced our natural gas furnace for a heat pump. That was the biggest bang for buck for us. Like, if we were going to reduce our emissions, investing in that heat pump was how we were going to make the most effective change in reducing our emissions. But for somebody different, like say there is a construction worker, let's say his name is Joe, and let's say he drives between Squamish and Vancouver every day for work. For Joe, the biggest source of his emissions is going to be his vehicle, and it is going to be, the most impactful action that Joe could take to reduce his emissions is by replacing his vehicle with an electric vehicle when one becomes available that suits his needs. So in the case of Joe, we would be asking Joe to say, hey, will you commit to buy an electric vehicle when you next plan to upgrade your truck? And maybe that's in 2 years, maybe it's in 5 years, maybe it's in 10 years, but just make that pledge and make that plan. And also to use it as an opportunity to educate people like Joe, because some people look at the price of an electric vehicle and go, oh, I can't afford that. Whereas in reality, if you compare the price of running an electric vehicle along with the sticker price of purchasing it compared to the price of buying a regular gas truck that goes along with the cost of paying for the fuel, it's much cheaper to invest in an electric vehicle over 5 years.
You're good.
Thank you.
You just have my brain rolling thinking about all the things I might consider. This doesn't seem like a difficult conversation or a difficult ask.
I don't think it is. I'm approaching it with the lens of storytelling.
Yeah.
And I'm approaching it with the lens of I'm not perfect. I can't be perfect. Nobody can be perfect because we're all living in a society right now that depends on fossil fuels. But the reason that we're still reliant on fossil fuels is because the oil and gas industry has spent billions of dollars to ensure that we don't invest in renewable energy and to advertise through misinformation campaigns to confuse people so that we delay climate action. So we've got some really big challenges, like the oil and gas industry have definitely done a lot to delay climate action over the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean, we've known for a long time that this was coming, and now we're at a crisis point. So we need to urgently take action, and we need to tell the oil and gas industry no more. We're not putting up with this anymore. You are on the way out, and we are making these big shifts, whether you like it or not. And this is how we're going to do it.
I'm curious what you think about what can be done about fossil fuel subsidies.
Ooh. So we're running a campaign right now. It's a joint campaign with a number of other organizations calling to end fossil fuel subsidies. So My Sea to Sky has actually had a number of letters and petitions that people have participated in, calling on the BC government to end fossil fuel subsidies. Because of that work, in collaboration with Stand and Wilderness Committee and Dogwood, the BC government did commit to review some of the worst fossil fuel subsidies for the fracking industry in particular. So that review is currently underway. But one of our biggest concerns is that the provincial and federal governments are going to continue giving fossil fuel companies new subsidies. So one of those, for example, is the incentives for carbon capture and storage. So this is essentially another fossil fuel subsidy that the federal government is proposing. And we're trying to counter that, saying, hang on a second, you're giving more money to the bad bad guys, that's not okay. So there's opportunities that are coming up. I mean, the provincial and federal governments have committed to end fossil fuel subsidies. And I think the federal government has actually brought forward their timeline for ending fossil fuel subsidies. But we need to keep the pressure up on this, because our big concern is that they will end the most visible subsidies, but that subsidies will be hidden in other ways and given to the oil and gas companies. And I mean, this is corporate welfare. And it's worse than corporate welfare, because these are some of the richest companies in the world. Most of them are foreign owned. There's no benefit to Canadians, and yet we're using our limited taxpayer dollars to essentially increase the profits of these oil and gas companies.
The idea that oil companies are working on carbon capture, for some reason just feels so wrong. But the whole thing is so overwhelming sometimes. I mean, it's pipelines, fossil fuels, LNG, old growth forest, mining, indigenous rights. The list just goes on and on. And now that we're in BC, you were quite vocal about Clean BC's roadmap to 2030. Can you elaborate?
Well, and this is why we flagged that Clean BC's roadmap to 2030 wasn't good enough, because you cannot have a climate action plan when the government is actively encouraging the expansion of fracking and LNG exports. Those two things can't go together. So we raised that flag when that was released, and many other organizations joined us in that conversation and calling out the BC government. So it's like, this isn't a climate action plan if you're continuing to expand the fossil fuel industry. BC NDP are trying to have their cake and eat it too, and you just can't.
So assuming that not everybody in government are bad people, how do you point out the hypocrisy without being confrontational? How do you bring about positive, sustainable change?
The Clean BC roadmap to 2030, right now, that is placing the burden on individuals to reduce emissions. And yes, while we're also trying to work to encourage individuals to reduce emissions, we need to do so much more than that. And so this is kind of like the campaign that we're running, the Zero Carbon Challenge, is the grassroots campaign. It's all about empowering individuals, empowering businesses. But there's another campaign that we're a part of. It's called the BC Climate Emergency Campaign. And in that campaign, we drafted an open letter to the government calling on them to take 10 urgent actions to confront the climate emergency. It's been signed by more than 350 organizations, businesses, unions, youth groups, seniors groups. It's really been amazing how broad this coalition of organizations and businesses is. And this is kind of the top-down approach. So it's saying, recognizing that individuals are doing everything that we can, but we also need the government to stop enabling fossil fuel expansion. You cannot announce a climate action plan and have C-SPAN talking about their LNG for shipping right next to you. Those two things, you just can't have them both. LNG is undermining the climate action. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of work that needs to be done. And I do want to recognize that the BC government is taking a lot more action than has happened in the past. But the problem is that we have delayed action for so long. And now we've got this very mediocre climate action plan that just doesn't cut it. We need so much more. We need to be so much more ambitious with our climate action. And we cannot place the burden on individuals just so that we can allow LNG Canada to export, and increase our emissions by the ridiculous amount that is going to be increased. So the BC government needs to do much better.
So you're a lot more diplomatic than I would be. You said earlier that leaders follow. So why does change take so long?
I think it's partly due to the misinformation campaigns by big oil and gas. A lot of people have really been fooled by that misinformation, and their goal was to create uncertainty. And if you look at what they've done with those misinformation campaigns, it's very similar to the tactics that they used for cigarettes, fooling people into thinking that cigarettes were okay, that they're healthy, that they're not causing lung cancer, and even just sowing that little seed of doubt so that it wasn't certain, it wasn't crystal clear. That's what they've done. And they've done it very, very cleverly. They've got very big budgets. They have, PR teams that craft words and they fool people. And now social media has allowed them to almost amplify that message. Like it seems like even more people are denying that climate change is real. And I think there's been studies done that show that in the US, for example, more people believed in climate change in the late 1980s and early 1990s than they do now. There's been a massive shift because of that. So I do want to point the finger at big oil and gas for willingly and knowingly putting profit over the well-being of people and the planet.
I guess we could have a longer conversation about capitalism.
Yes, we could.
It reminds me of Jason Moore's book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, a guide to capitalism, nature, and the future of the planet. He believes that nature, money, work, care, food, energy, and lives are the 7 things that have made our world and will shape its future. In making these things cheap, modern commerce has transformed, governed, and devastated Earth. So I'm curious, do you believe that climate change and racial injustice share the same roots?
But yes, I think absolutely they do. I mean, and it all comes back to capitalism.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And this is one of the challenges that I think we're facing is we're definitely trying to solve all of the problems all at the same time. And I think that in many ways, it's making our work a lot more difficult, but it is also essential to it. Yeah, that's why we're trying to address equity and social justice as part of what we're doing.
This is another episode of the Conversation Lab. My name is Don Schaefer, and today we're speaking with Tracey Saxby, who's the executive director of My Sea to Sky. And as well as talking about the capital scene, we're also talking about My Sea to Sky, the work they do. And I'm curious, what's the hardest thing you do?
Oh, it's overwhelming at times. My Sea to Sky is very, very small. We are a very small organization with a very big heart. We are people powered, but as far as paid staff, we only transitioned to having paid staff a few years ago. And right now there's only 2 of us. So despite that, though, people think that we're a lot bigger than we are. And we just don't have the capacity to take on all of the campaigns that we wish we could take on. We get asked to, take on everything from stopping plastic bags and single-use plastics to stopping old growth logging to what's going on with Garibaldi at Squamish, what's happening with municipal politics. Yeah, it's a lot. And our primary campaign, of course, the one that we started with is to stop wood fiber LNG and the Fortescue pipeline that's associated with it. So, the overwhelm can be hard, and funding is always a challenge too.
So what called you to this work?
So as a background, I'm a trained marine scientist. And in my professional career, wearing that hat, I'm a visual science communication consultant. So what I do is I take research and data, I make it simple, I make it visual, I make it really easy to access, really easy to understand. That's what I've done professionally for the last 20 years. When wood fiber LNG was first proposed, I actually thought it was a good idea. Having spent a long time in Squamish, I knew how much the community hurt after the pulp mill shut down, and many of the workers moved away and had to find work elsewhere. So like many other people, I was also fooled into thinking that natural glass was clean, it's green, it's more environmentally friendly. So when the project was first proposed, I was just like, oh, well, let's find out more about this. So I started going to the information sessions, and that was when I very quickly changed my mind. This project is going to undermine all of the hard work that so many people have dedicated to restore Howe Sound and to bring it back to life. So it's also going to threaten the health and safety of everybody that lives within the Howe Sound region, whether that is a reduction in air quality or from the safety risk of having LNG tankers transiting Howe Sound. And for me, the biggest concern was the climate impacts of building new fossil fuel infrastructure and locking in that climate pollution for decades. So that has been one of my biggest drivers. But for many other people, they've got different concerns that make them worried about wood fiber LNG.
What keeps you up at night?
Whether we're going to be able to successfully stop wood fiber LNG. That and the climate emergency is a big stressor for me. I'm finding that as we're seeing more clearly the impacts of climate change here in Canada, that's making me anxious, because nowhere is going to be safe. And whether it is, like the fact that summers feel like it's wildfire season now. It's not summer anymore. It's not like, hey, let's go to the lake. Hey, let's go to the beach and hang out. It's wildfire season. And I can't go outside when it's smoky. I feel so ill, like